Parshas Shoftim, as the name of the Sedra indicates, deals, at least initially, it deals with the laws of the appointing of judges, and primarily the appointment of judges to the laws surrounding the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, although in every area, in every city, there was a requirement to have a Beis Din also, but the main Beis Din was the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel. And the High Court of Israel was the pillar of the oral tradition. And they were the final authority on any question that would come up. And the Torah tells us that when there is a question in one of the cities, the Bati Dinim of the cities, the courts of the cities, and it cannot be resolved, so this question is then referred ultimately to the Beis Din Hagadol, to the High Court of Israel. And the Torah tells us an expression, the kamta, when you have this question, the kamta v'elisa, you shall rise up and ascend to the place that Hashem your God shall choose. In other words, as pointed out in other places, the Torah here is reiterating that the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, had to sit in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Lishkas Hagazis. And matter of fact, according to the Ramban, some say the Rambam disagrees, some say he doesn't disagree, but according to the Ramban, if the High Court of Israel is not sitting in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Lishkas, or the Lishkas Hagazis, whatever it might be, in the Beis Hamikdash, so it loses its special status as the High Court of Israel. It still is considered an authority, but not in the same manner that it was when it was in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. And this halacha is repeated to us in other places as well. Some say that actually it's mentioned at the beginning of this week's Sedra. The Torah says, Shoftim b'shotrim titen l'chol b'chol sharecha. It speaks about appointing judges in all your cities who serve under the guidance and the approval of the High Court of Israel. And immediately afterwards, the Torah says, Lo sita l'cha ashera kol eitz shel mizbach Hashem Elokecha. You shall not plant for yourself a tree or an idolatrous tree near the Mizbeach, near the altar of Hashem. And so the talking about judges in conjunction with talking about the altar of God. So that implies that the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, had special status as being the seat of the High Court of Israel. And it's also mentioned in Eila HaMishpatim, in Chumash Shemos. In Eila HaMishpatim, the Torah tells us that first it talks about how the Mizbeach, the altar, could be constructed, that it was a ramp leading up to the altar. There wouldn't be stairs. It had to be made of stones. Metal couldn't be used in the construction of the altar, but and immediately afterwards it says, these are the ordinances, the laws that you shall place before them. And there it talks about different laws that were administrated by Beis Din, by the court. So Rashi cites the Medrash that the reason, the juxtaposition between the laws of the Mizbeach, the laws of building of the altar, and the laws of justice, how justice is to be met out. That is to tell us that the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, had to sit in the temple near the altar. So we really have to understand two things. The first question is, why was it so important that the High Court of Israel sit in the Beis HaMikdash, sit in the temple? Why could they not have another place? Actually, 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, before the destruction of the temple, because of what was going on at the time, the High Court of Israel moved out of the temple. Well, certainly out of the Lishkas HaGazis, out of its special chamber in the temple. And the High Court of Israel, but it lost its special status, certainly according to the Ramban. It lost its special status when it moved out of the temple. So we have to understand, why is it important? After all, the High Court of Israel was not engaged in the service of the temple. They weren't giving korbanos. So why was it so important that they should sit in the Beis HaMikdash? And the other question is, it seems there is something special about the relationship between the Mizbeach, between the altar, and the High Court of Israel. And the question is, why? Because it says that it just like they have to sit near the altar in the temple. So what is unique about the altar? That the altar is used as the identification mark to tell us that the Beis Din Hagadol had to sit in the Beis HaMikdash and perhaps near the altar. So I think that this could be understood with a Ramban that I have mentioned a number of times. The Ramban, at the beginning of Shmos, his approach in Chumash was that each Chumash had its special theme. And the theme of Chumash Shmos was the Exodus. The Ramban mentions this when he discusses in his introduction to Chumash Shmos, and he also makes a reference to this point in his Parish, in his commentary in Parshas Truma in Chumash Shmos. And the Ramban says, so we can understand the significance of Chumash Shmos from Ve'ela Shmos B'nai Yisrael, from the very beginning until Matan Torah, or perhaps including Parshas Mishpatim, because in a certain sense, the giving of the Torah, the Sinai experience, that was the goal of the exodus of the Jewish people. So it adapts very well to the theme of Chumash Shmos. The theme of Chumash Shmos is the exodus. But the second half of Chumash Shmos primarily deals with the construction of the Mishkan, with the construction of the tabernacle. It would seem that the details about the construction of Chumash of the tabernacle would have been better off being mentioned in Chumash Vayikra, which talks about the service, which talks about the korbanos, which talks about the sacrifices, all of which were given in the tabernacle in the Mishkan. And the Ramban suggests this idea. He says that the purpose of the Mishkan was to serve as a vehicle to transfer the Kedusha of Mount Sinai from Sinai to ultimately Jerusalem when Solomon's temple was built. And therefore, it's in Chumash Shmos. In other words, the building of the Mishkan, with all its details, in a sense represents the perpetuation of Sinai. And if Sinai and the Sinai experience and the Torah given in Sinai is identified with the Exodus, then the building of the temple, of the tabernacle, which was the vehicle transferring the sanctity of Sinai to Jerusalem, should also be in Chumash Shmos. This is what the Ramban says. Now, according to the Ramban, so Chumash Shmos, so the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is what enabled the temple in Jerusalem to be seen as the perpetuation of Sinai. In other words, in a sense, Sinai does not come to an end when the Jewish people leave Sinai. The Jewish people take Sinai with them and bring it to Jerusalem over periods of hundreds of years. And the temple in Jerusalem is the perpetuation, the continuation of Sinai. And logic dictates the Sinai experience is identified as avodah, as service to God. Bahotziacha, God told Moshe Rabbeinu, Bahotziacha esa'am min Mitzrayim, tavdu nosi al hor hazeh. When you take the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, you shall serve me at this mountain. It's the symbol of service. And we know, of course, of the altars that were built at Sinai. And, of course, the Beis HaMikdash, as well as the Mishkan, as the tabernacle, contained in it the Aseret Dibros, the tablets of the Ten Commandments were contained in it. And also contained in it was the Mishkan, also was the Sefer Torah, the special Sefer Torah. God told Moshe before he died to leave one Sefer Torah in the Mishkan. And then Ezra, in the second tabernacle, at the second Beis HaMikdash, he wrote a Sefer Torah also that was placed in the Beis HaMikdash. So that represents the perpetuation of the Torah Shebal, of the written Torah. And the Bezdin Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, they represent they are the Amud Torah Shebal Peh, the pillar of the oral tradition. And the oral tradition was also given to Moshe at Sinai. So it's the perpetuation, not only of the Torah Shebal, but it's the perpetuation. The temple was the perpetuation of the Torah Shebal Peh, of the oral tradition as well. And in a sense, we could say, and that perhaps could be used to explain the difference, why we need psukim in Parshas Shoftim as well as Parshas Mishpatim, to tell us that the Bezdin Hagadol, that the High Court of Israel, sat at the temple, near the Mizbeach, near the altar. We could suggest that really there are two reasons. On one hand, the temple had to be the perpetuation of Sinai. And in addition, the Bezdin Hagadol had to be, the High Court of Israel had to be the perpetuation of the giving over of the Torah. Let me explain what I mean. The Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim says that someone who rejects the authority of Bezdin Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, and rejects their interpretation of the law, in effect, he is going against Moshe Rabbeinu and his Torah. Now we can understand the idea that he's going against the Torah of Moshe, because, as the Rambam himself says in Hilchos Mamrim, the Torah was given over in accordance with the interpretation of the Bezdin Hagadol future generations. It doesn't mean that they could interpret it any way they want. The interpretation had to be in its true understanding of the Torah. But the Rambam says that one who goes against it is going against Moshe Rabbeinu and his Torah. Why does he say that he goes against Moshe Rabbeinu and the Torah? Now, there is a halacha brought down in the Gemara in Sanhedrin that Moshe kishivim v'chad koi. Moshe Rabbeinu himself had the status of Bezdin Hagadol, of the High Court of Israel. Now, there are two ways to understand it. In other words, the High Court of Israel, they are the ultimate judges of the Jewish people. And Moshe Rabbeinu, in his time, or at least in the earlier part of the exodus of the Jewish people while they were in the Midbar, in the desert. So Kol Hador HaKasha, any difficulty that couldn't be resolved with the lower courts were brought to Moshe Rabbeinu. No, it's Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of the High Court of Israel. But we could explain it a little differently. And we could say, when the Gemara says, Moshe kishivim v'chad koi, that Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of the High Court of Israel, it's just the reverse. It's phrased that way, but the true meaning might be that the High Court of Israel is in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And we could understand that the Torah wanted the Jew to see the psak, the decision of Bezdin Hagadol, and the teaching that Bezdin Hagadol did, that the High Court of Israel did, as it was given by Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai. Now, so therefore, the High Court of Israel had to sit in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, which was in place of Sinai. And the High Court of Israel was in place of Moshe. And this was to emphasize the idea that the psak, the decision of the High Court of Israel was to be treated like that was relayed by God, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai. So that's a law regarding the status of the High Court of Israel. In other words, the High Court of Israel had to be recognized as acting in the place of Moshe Rabbeinu at Mount Sinai. But in addition, we needed the High Court of Israel, who was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, in order that the Beis Hamikdash, that the temple, should be seen as a perpetuation of Matan Torah, because Moshe Rabbeinu himself was certainly essential to the giving of the Torah. And for the Beis Hamikdash, for the temple to be seen as the perpetuation of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, it was necessary to have somebody there acting in the capacity of Moshe Rabbeinu to a certain degree. So it was two reasons. One is it's necessary for the Beis Hamikdash to have someone in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. On the other hand, it's necessary for the Beis Din HaGadol, for the High Court of Israel, to be in the temple, that people should recognize its psak, its decision, and perhaps even for the members of the Beis Din HaGadol to recognize that what they're saying in the name of Moshe Rabbeinu. Sometimes, of course, the people that sat on the Beis Din HaGadol were on such a high level. But we find some Tanaim, great scholars, people who were leaders of the Jewish people. Sometimes, on rare occasions, even they deviate. And we had all kinds of rebellious movements against the Torah by people who were originally great scholars and great teachers of Torah. You had Elisha ben Avua, you had the Stukim, the Baisusim, whose founders were students of the Tanoim. So it's important on one hand that the Jewish people should recognize the Beis Din HaGadol as being the replacement or the successors to Moshe Rabbeinu. At the same time, it's important for the Beis Din HaGadol itself to recognize that they are acting in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. They shouldn't think in terms of themselves, but they should think in terms of what did Moshe Rabbeinu say. So because of that, it was necessary for the Beis Din HaGadol to sit in the Beis Hamikdash. And we could say, even if we say the reverse, that Moshe Rabbeinu was acting as Beis Din HaGadol, not Beis Din HaGadol acting on behalf of Moshe. So in a sense, Moshe Rabbeinu, as the Beis Din HaGadol of his time, he brought down the Torah to Mount Sinai. And therefore, Beis Din HaGadol has to sit in the temple to give the appearance that their psakim, their evaluations, their judgments are a perpetuation and a continuation of the giving of the Torah. Now, it's very interesting, but I think there is another point, and it's really not so much another point, it reiterates the first point. And it's interesting that in Parshas Yisro, when Yisro comes with Zipporah and with Moshe's two sons, and he brings them to Moshe. And the beginning of Parshas Yisro discusses how everybody, the initial meeting between Yisro and Moshe and Aaron, and the karbonos that they gave, the sacrifices that they gave. And then Moshe, it says, Vayhim Machras, it was the next day. And our sages say, what does the next day mean? The day after Matan Torah. The day after giving of the Torah. In a sense, it represents the perpetuation of the giving of the Torah. So Yisro is upset because Moshe assumed the full burden upon himself. And all the people line up Boker ad Erev, from morning to evening, to ask him questions. And Moshe, and ultimately Yisro suggests that Moshe appoint judges who will serve underneath him. And the difficult questions will be brought to Moshe. But when Yisro asked Moshe, what are you doing? Look at the burden that you're placing upon yourself, that you're placing upon the nation. And so Moshe says to his father-in-law, to Yisro, the people come to me to seek God. He didn't just say they come to me to get the psak, to get the law. But he said, they come to me to seek God. In other words, when they came to Moshe with a question, it was, in a sense, the perpetuation of Matan Torah. We know, I mentioned many times, that part of the experience, we say Pesach, Ilu kervanu lifnei har Sinai v'lo nasan lanu es haTorah dayenu. We say, if God had brought us close at Mount Sinai and didn't give us the Torah, that in itself would have been great. And the question is, what would have been so great? A coming to Mount Sinai and not getting the Torah. But in addition to getting the Torah at Mount Sinai, there was revelation. God revealed himself. The people saw themselves. They sensed the presence of God. And when they came to Moshe, that perpetuated that same experience. So he said, Ilu kervanu lifnei har Sinai, if we just had the experience of Sinai, even without the Torah of Sinai, that would have been great. But of course, now things are much, much greater because we got the Torah at Sinai also. And the Torah has the ability, and does give us that sense of closeness to God. And I should point out here, it's well known that there was a dispute between Reb Chaim Volozhiner and the Baal HaTanya as to the definition of Torah Lishma. According to Reb Chaim Volozhiner, Torah Lishma is for the intellectual love of Torah. Now, not chas v'sholem, when I say intellectual love of Torah, I don't mean to treat chas v'sholem Torah as a history book. Intellectual love of Torah means the love of the study of Torah. However, Baal Tanya says that Torah Lishma seems to be a form of dveikus, of attachment to God. And the Reb Chaim Volozhin doesn't disagree that the nature of Torah, and he emphasizes, Torah makes one feel close to God. And he says it's important when you learn Torah every so often to stop for a moment to feel that closeness. But they're just arguing what the terminology of Torah Lishma means. It seems from the Rambam more like the Baal Tanya, and from the Rush, it seems more like Reb Chaim Volozhin. But whatever it is, the Torah in itself gives a person the ability. Of course, you find people that could use Torah for the very opposite purposes. You find people that use Torah learning to build a wall between them and God. But Torah has that ability, if we use it, to not just study it, but to feel a sense of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, closest to God. When they came to Moshe to ask Moshe what to do, Moshe wasn't just a computer that you could type in the question, Google, and then get an answer. No. Through Moshe, and to a certain degree, I think this might be true. Of course, today, there's a lot of Torah that's learned over the computer. And those people who spoke out against technology didn't anticipate that situations would arise, that shiurim would be given over the computer. The necessity, they didn't anticipate a pandemic. But, I met with a couple weeks ago with a certain parent who has a child that's on the spectrum. And they told me that they were told by a rabbi, they didn't mention the name of the rabbi, that they should get rid of all technology. People don't have that ability to understand, that one situation is different than another situation. You can't say low plug. Honestly, I think you have to teach children limitations on technology. And when you take the technology out of the house, you are teaching them how not to have limitations, that there can't be limitations. And when they're going to be introduced to technology later on in life, then they will be using the technology for all kinds of purposes that are not appropriate. But at least understand that no two cases are the same. When a child is on the spectrum and they have trouble making social connections. And you don't let them use a computer, even for good purposes. You're asking for a lot of trouble. So the idea is a person, the idea of coming to learn Torah, in a sense, and to even asking a shaila. And I'll point it out later, when Bezdin Hagadol paskin the shaila, it wasn't just psak, it wasn't just a decision. Bezdin Hagadol was teaching Torah. So it was lidrosh hasalakim. It's not just a question, but in the sense there has to be this idea of this sensation of closeness to God. And that's an additional, but certainly by Bezdin Hagadol. That's the perpetuation of the Sinai experience. Because Sinai, God brought us close on Mount Sinai. What was the Sinai experience? The Sinai experience was sensing the presence of God. So when we come to Bezdin Hagadol, we're not just talking an intellectual, we're not just having an intellectual question. We want to sense the presence of God. And so therefore it's both a law, it's a din in the Bezdin Hagadol. The Bezdin Hagadol is perpetuating Torah's Moshe. Torah's Moshe is lidrosh hasalakim. But at the same time, the Bezdin Hagadol being in the Beis Hamikdash, that is perpetuating Sinai. Because the idea of the Beis Hamikdash, the idea of Sinai, is part of it, is sensing the presence of God. Okay, this week, we're going to have start Rosh Chodesh Elul, the second day of Rosh Chodesh Elul. I mentioned it before. We start blowing the shofar. What's the idea? The idea of the shofar is we shouldn't make the golden calf. Why is it? Because unfortunately, while it's true, coming close to Moshe manifests itself in feeling closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Moshe. The unfortunate facts were that the Jewish people were not yet ready for a situation when Moshe wasn't there. So when when the Moshe went up for 40 days, somehow they lost that sensation of closeness to God. Because they lost that sensation of closeness to God, they built the golden calf. So when Moshe went up the second time, they blew the shofar, because the shofar is how God made his presence known to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. Uvikol shofar hafata. And Moshe Rabbeinu went up the second time on Rosh Chodesh Elul. So that's why in Rosh Chodesh Elul we blow the shofar, because to a certain sense, we have to understand that even when Moshe isn't there, we have to feel that closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why afterwards it was necessary to have a Bezdin Hagadol who acted in place of Moshe. So the idea of Bezdin Hagadol being in the Beis Hamikdash is identified with the idea of lidrosh hasalakim. Now, and in a sense, the idea of the mizbeach, the idea of the altar, I already mentioned. The mizbeach was identified with karban. What is the karban? The karban was it comes from the word karev. It was the act of feeling closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, coming to God. So the Beis Hamikdash had to be a place where one felt that closeness of coming to God. But when you had the psak of Bezdin Hagadol, the decision of the High Court of Israel, you also had to have that same feeling. Now there is a question. About this law, that Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of Bezdin Hagadol, of the High Court of Israel. Because the Rambam mentions, now, before I go that, this thing that Moshe Rabbeinu had, this law, that Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of Bezdin Hagadol, and the Bezdin Hagadol, in a sense, is the replacement of Moshe Rabbeinu. We could explain a strange Rashi in Maseches Brachas. Rashi in Brachas says that with David HaMelech, when he went to war, so he told them to check with Sanhedrin Hagdolah before they went to war. And Rashi said, why should they check with Sanhedrin Hagdolah? They should check with Sanhedrin Hagdolah, with the High Court of Israel, that the Sanhedrin Hagdolah should be mispalel, should pray for them when they go to war. The Jewish people at that time were suffering from economic problems. Many explain it because there was a Gidur Amaleki, a battalion of Amalekites that were harassing the Jewish people. And so David HaMelech gave his consent to go to war. But he said, before you go to war, consult with the Bezdin Hagadol. And Rashi says, why? A very strange Rashi. There's a lot to be said on it. But Rashi says that they should daven for you. The question is, where do we find a law that Bezdin Hagadol should daven for the Jewish people where they go to war? Every Jew should daven. But why specifically Bezdin Hagadol should daven? But I was thinking, especially since this was the war with Amalek. In the original battle with Amalek, Moshe Rabbeinu goes on top of the mountain and he raises his hands in prayer. So, in other words, that set the precedent for all wars against Amalek, and perhaps for all wars, that Moshe Rabbeinu has to be mispalo. And when Moshe Rabbeinu is not there, the successor to Moshe Rabbeinu has to be mispalo. And who is the successor to Moshe Rabbeinu? The successor to Moshe Rabbeinu is the Bezdin Hagadol, the High Court of Israel. And I think that and if you say that it wasn't, so there it happened to be, some of the commentaries point out that it was a Gedud Amaleki. But even if you say that it wasn't a Gedud Amaleki, it was all wars. In other words, it's important for the people to be aware that whatever victory they obtained is because war presents this test that a person might say, my hands did it, my weapons did it. So it's important, yes, your weapons were used, but it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu that did it. It was God that did it. And that's why when Moshe Rabbeinu went on top of the mountain, he had to raise his hands in prayer, that the people should see that their success was dependent upon the prayer of Moshe Rabbeinu. So similarly, it had to be known that the Bezdin Hagadol was praying on behalf of the Jewish people. So if it's a Dur Amaleki, if it's because it was Amalekites that were fighting, so we could explain it that All the wars of Amalek represent a perpetuation and a continuation of the original war of Amalek. And if it's something that applies to all wars, it's to emphasize in front of the Jewish people that the success you had is Hashem Nisi. God was my miracle. God was my banner. And that is demonstrated through the Bezdin Hagadol, who are the successors of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, there is a question that is asked, and the question is, the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim says that the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim says that you need Bezdin Hagadol to approve of who is appointed king. And he says, like Moshe Rabbeinu, Ubezdino, Moshe Rabbeinu and his Bezdin had to approve of Yehoshua as being king, to appoint him king in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the question is, if Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of Bezdin Hagadol, why did Moshe Rabbeinu need his court, his Bezdin, together with him? After all, he himself had the status of the High Court of Israel. Now, the Brisker Rav says that Moshe Rabbeinu only originally had the status of Bezdin Hagadol, but in Parshas Ba'aloscha, when 70 Skenim are appointed and they're taken into the Mishkan, so from that point onward, Moshe Rabbeinu is the head of the Bezdin, but Moshe Rabbeinu loses the status of being the Bezdin Hagadol. They bring an answer, a different answer from my grandfather, and my grandfather said that Moshe Rabbeinu, he had the status of Bezdin Hagadol, but only when he had two others with him. So, because a Bezdin requires three people. A Bezdin requires three people. So when it says Moshe Bezdino approved of Yoshua being the successor of Moshe and becoming the leader and the king of the Jewish people, it's only because Moshe had a Bezdin. But Moshe, in order to have the status of Bezdin Hagadol, needed two others with him. And my uncle suggested an altogether different answer. He said that if it's a question of halacha, of determining what Jewish law is, so Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't need anybody else, because no one can disagree with Moshe Rabbeinu when it comes to halacha. But if it's a question of appointment, so then Moshe Rabbeinu has to do that as part of Bezdin Hagadol, as part of the High Court. Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of Bezdin Hagadol only when it came to Psak, because there no one could join him. But when it came to appointment, Moshe Rabbeinu, once the High Court was established, Moshe Rabbeinu was just the Nasi, was the head of the Bezdin Hagadol, the High Court of Israel. Now the question is that, so how we are to understand, according to my grandfather, Moshe Rabbeinu only had the status of the High Court of Israel when he had two others with him. Moshe Rabbeinu certainly did not go to Har Sinai with two other people. So when he was bringing the Torah down, he brought the Torah down himself. not as the Bezdin Hagadol, not as the High Court of Israel. So from that perspective, we have to go back to our original question. Why was it important for the Bezdin Hagadol why was it important for the Bezdin Hagadol to sit in the Beis Hamikdash, but they, in a sense, were not acting as Moshe Rabbeinu. So I think we could understand it with taking notice of another very difficult medrash. The medrash tells us that when the Mishkan was created, there was some question as to whether they should make the Mishkan first or they should make the utensils of the Mishkan first. And Bezalel said that they should make the Moshe originally said that you should make the utensils first, and then Bezalel said they should make the Mishkan first. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, "Bezalel, you that is really what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told me." In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu first didn't realize it himself. And there's a question: how is it possible that Moshe Rabbeinu, that Bezalel understood something that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't understand? How are we to understand that? Matter of fact, there's someone who published a sefer once, and he wanted to explain what was the argument between Moshe and Bezalel. And he asked Reb Chaim for Haskama, and Reb Chaim told him you have to take that piece out because Moshe Rabbeinu can't be wrong. So he suggested that it would even be apicursus to suggest that Moshe Rabbeinu was wrong. So the question is, why is it that? So how is it possible? But we have to understand, what is the Medrash telling us? That Moshe said to Bezalel, "You understood what God said to me." So I think we could suggest that when the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu not just to word for word, but it was given to him derech limud, in the form of learning. It was given to him in the form of learning. So a discussion that he had with Bezalel was part of the revelation. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him everything, but he came to understand it on the basis of discussions that he had immediately afterwards. And we could say, those who say that Moshe Rabbeinu had to sit with a Bezdin Hagadol, how can Moshe Rabbeinu sit together with the High Court of Israel? How could they contradict him? How could they vote when Moshe Rabbeinu says the halacha is one way? It could be they didn't vote. They couldn't vote. But nevertheless, it was important to be a Bezdin to discuss the halacha. Even Moshe Rabbeinu discussed the halachas. And this was part of the revelation of explaining what God said. And it's not that God didn't tell it to him. God told it to him. But Moshe Rabbeinu came to understand it through the discussion with the members of his Bezdin. And that's how we could understand what the Brisker Rav and my grandfather said, that Moshe Rabbeinu was part of a Bezdin, and only was part of a Bezdin because the Bezdin didn't argue with Moshe Rabbeinu, but they discussed the Torah with Moshe Rabbeinu. And why is that important? In other words, it's to emphasize the point that the Torah was given derech limud. And the Torah was given to understand through learning, not just by being told by being told. And I think this is part of the problem that we have today. Part of the problem we have today, that a wedge has been created between psak, between asking shilas and learning. You have people who are considered great poskim, but one will not turn to them to try to understand the Rambam. And you have people, on the other hand, who are great lumdim, but one will not rely on them when it comes to psak halacha. And it represents a weakness. In other words, it means that when we say pshat, when we say an explanation in Torah, so we have doubts about it. Maybe we're not searching for the true answer. We're just trying to say a pshat. But we really don't care what the Rambam really meant. We're just trying to answer the question against the Rambam. So that represents a lack of emes, a lack of the midah of emes, of truth. That's why. But if someone is motivated by truth, so when he says a Chiddush Torah, when he says Torah in a certain manner, so he says it in a manner that when he says a Chiddush Torah, he in a manner that he would be ready to paskin a shaila. He would be ready to paskin a shaila on that basis. So this is so in a sense, there are many people, when they look at the tshuvas of Rav Moshe Feinstein, Igros Moshe, they'll take a look at the first paragraph where the shaila is mentioned, and then they'll go to the last paragraph, the conclusion. They're not interested in the learning. But Bezdin Hagadol's role was not just the paskin. Bezdin Hagadol's role was to teach, to give Torah over. So when the Moshe Rabbeinu, the Bezdin Hagadol, when Moshe Rabbeinu acted as the Bezdin Hagadol with the other judges with him, it was for the perspective of teaching Torah, of giving Torah over. Moshe Rabbeinu might have brought the Torah down himself, but part of Kabbalah's Torah was giving it over to the Jewish people. So first of all, when he sat with the Bezdin, there was a discussion. It had to be derech limud, through the process of learning. But in addition, the giving over of the Torah to the Jewish people, that was done in conjunction with others as well, together with the other members of his Bezdin. So the Bezdin Hagadol sitting in the Lishkas Hagazis is the perpetuation of Matan Torah. It's the perpetuation. It gives the Beis Hamikdash the status of Har Sinai, and it gives the Bezdin Hagadol the status of Moshe Rabbeinu when he was giving over the Torah, learning the Torah, and teaching the Torah to the Jewish people. Okay.
So anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. So does that mean when the Gemara says that the Seder of Moshe, first he taught Aaron, and then he taught Aaron's sons, and then he taught the Sanhedrin, then he told it to everyone, that wasn't just a fact, that was part of the way that Torah...
That was part of, that's right. That's right.
And then when Moshe left and Aaron repeated it another time, was that still part of the way that Torah was given over?
That was the way the Torah was given over. Yeah, but I'm talking specifically the people when they would come with their shilas to Moshe, Davar HaKosher Yavin Eli, so that the Davar HaKosher they would bring to him Moshe, according to my grandfather and according to the Brisker Rav, he would sit together with others.
Okay.
He would sit together with others. But what you say is certainly true. Okay, any other questions, sir?
Not yet.
Okay.
So also what you said, could that be one of the interpretations of the famous Ritva and Eruvin about Elu Divra Lakim Chaim, that Hashem gave him 70 sides laheter and 70 sides lesser, and then so Moshe said, "What's the psak?" And he said, "Whatever the base didn't decide." So Hashem gave him all the reasons, and he discussed it with the Sanhedrin. Then they decided which way was the
what I would assume the pshat is, in other words, it's when Reb Chaim would explain the difference between Rishonim and Achronim. So in other words, a Rishon, when he says something that there is no problems, if you fully understand it, there is no problems with it. But which shita is 100% is the one that was meant lahalacha, that's something Sanhedrin had to decide. But to Sanhedrin in deciding, it's not so much that they had a choice that they could have thrown a dice, to say which is accepted. But the idea is Sanhedrin, there are so many possibilities. Each one of them is a legitimate possibility. But when the Sanhedrin decided this is the one that they thought, and they were then acting in their capacity as Bezdin Hagadol.
Okay, another question on this topic. Would this explain why Moshe didn't understand Rabbi Akiva's darshaning?
Okay, so there are two explanations given to that. One is that I wouldn't apply it to that. That was much later. But the one explanation is once the Torah was given, in other words, Rabbi Akiva gave the drasha after the Torah was given, and Moshe Rabbeinu was looking at it before the completion of the giving of the Torah. That's one explanation that's given. But another explanation is that he was Doresh Kisrei Osios, the crowns on top of the Torah, and there are two forms of ksav, two forms of the written alphabet in halacha, the ksav ashuris and ksav levnoi. So in the time of the first temple, they used primarily ksav levnoi. This is how the Brisker Rav explains it. They used ksav levnoi. The Torah in ksav levnoi didn't have any of the crowns on it. Where in ksav ashuris, there were crowns on it. So at that point, Moshe Rabbeinu was not yet exposed. It is only through seeing Rabbi Akiva that he became exposed to the ksav ashuris. But up till that point, he only had the ksav levnoi. So that's why he couldn't explain it. And the ksav ashuris was given to Moshe later on, but it was given to him later on for the future, not so much for the present time, for the contemporary time, for his time.
So as someone asked, should teenagers have smartphones and laptops, or only with filters, or even without filters, or filters aren't enough, or what?
Listen, no two children are the same, although in a house would be probably very difficult to say one child shouldn't have it, the other child should have it, and the third one should have it with a filter. I mean, but no two situations are exactly the same. That was the point that I was trying to make. But ideally, the filter has to be in the child's head, not in the phone. And if you just don't allow technology, and I'm not saying there might be a certain situation where you shouldn't, but that's the exception. That shouldn't be the rule. The rule should be we teach children how to have a filter in their head. And I think that's something that we fail to recognize. You know how much trouble was caused by the telephone, but nobody will say, don't have a telephone. These children are all going to be exposed later on to it. In Chicago, 2 years ago, they had this massive conference where tons of money was poured. Looking back, what greater things could have been accomplished with that money. Handicapped children who have trouble getting Torah education could get Torah education. 2 years later, when we look back, when we do something, especially when we do something on behalf of the community, using community money, we shouldn't look at it from the perspective of this one moment. We have to say, how are we going to look back at it? There are so many things that are important. What we have to work on is teaching children to have filters in their minds, not so much filters in their phones.
This is getting a little bit off topic, but following up on that, the way that they took an accounting after they built the Mishkan to make sure that all the gold and all the silver so should the community have audits on community projects to make sure that goals were reached, or if they ended up that they set the wrong goal, or this?
Listen, every situation is different. Every community organization is different. Everything is different, and I don't want to get involved in too much politics. You know, it's going to cause a lot of fighting. So every situation is different.
But as individuals, people, if someone decided something and they need to quote Mr. Shisharim here, to be Yamash and Yafashvesh, to look back and look forward to see what to do. So is it important? What applied to the individual? Should that apply?
I say every situation is different. I don't want to start a political war. That's.
But should the community have some oversight to make sure that, to look back and think that they were making right decisions, or
I really
not to
think
criticize them?
It goes back to my point that people have to work to have filters in their mind. You know, each person, each group, I'm sure everybody will appoint a group that will accommodate what they want. You understand?
As a blog group.
Yeah, that's everyone will appoint a group that they want. So I don't think anything is accomplished by it. But what we need is that we need that people should have filters in their mind.
Well, could you combine that with something else that you've discussed? Should the parents decide what the filter should be, or should they say whatever the school says the filter should be?
The parents should talk with the schools, and together they should decide it. Mm-hmm. They should decide it together. That's all. But
we don't have any.
It's probably very difficult to do when the schools are just totally against it altogether. It's unfortunate, you know.
There are not any more questions, so thank you very much, Rabbi, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good week. Have a good Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is Thursday and Friday. Rosh Chodesh Elul. And God willing, same time, same code next Sunday.
Okay.